Welcome to Aging Wisely, the podcast, a show that aims to center the lives and needs of the aging and disabled communities, a platform for the issues that matter to them most, a space for them and those who work with and alongside them. I am Veronica Escobar, the producer and host. My goal is to educate and transform. This week's guest is Anne Foerg, a New York City-based geriatric social worker who currently works as a program manager at a NORC. More on what those are in a few minutes. She has worked with older people for 20 years, and like a few of my past guests, her life experience is what influenced her to pursue working within this demographic, specifically her grandparents and their own medical issues.
So I had a grandfather that developed cancer and passed away. And then the three living grandparents that I then had all developed different types of dementia. Both of my grandmothers developed Alzheimer's disease, and my maternal grandfather developed dementia with Lewy bodies.
She saw firsthand the circle of life, how her parents and their siblings had to, as she put it, quote, step up and take care of their own parents in the same way that their parents had cared for them. She also saw the difficulties that came with caring for an aging parent, not only emotionally, but logistically and on very practical levels. She went on to tell me what I like to refer to as the tale of the two sets of grandparents.
Where my dad's parents had actually done very well for themselves financially. They had amassed a good amount of resources, thankfully, that they were able to use and to provide for their care. And we were so grateful that we had these resources. In contrast, my mom's parents were a very different story. My mom was from a working class background. My grandfather was a window washer, later a religious articles salesman. He provided for his family, but he didn't amass a lot of resources, and his Social Security was his only form of retirement income, and it was minimal. So by the time my maternal grandmother became ill and then my grandfather became sick, there wasn't much to provide for their care. They had to be transitioned to nursing homes, and they had to be transitioned to nursing homes on Medicaid.
And what she saw was the disparate treatment and the difficulties for her mother and siblings.
And watching the differential between my grandparents with resources and how much better the care was for them than my grandparents without resources was really shocking and frustrating. My mom had to give a lot of herself during these years. You know, she made sure that she was visiting her parents, and my mom was, really at a nursing home almost every day for a period of 5 years, making sure that her parents were being fed and well cared for. And there were wonderful caregivers, thankfully. They were also significantly understaffed. So they really didn't, they didn't get the best care that they could have. So this is the foundation on which my interest was built, was watching it happen in my family.
The reason why I wanted to have you on is because you work in a NORC. NORCs, that's short for naturally occurring retirement communities. The first ever NORC is actually the NORC that you work in. That was built and started in 1986, so it's 34 years old. NORCs exist in big cities like New York. They exist in suburban areas. They also exist in rural areas. They look a little different. Essentially, they are communities that evolve because older people live in them. Is the circumstance with your grandparents what ultimately led you to become a social worker?
Yeah, it really was. And when I came to New York to go to college, and what was particularly interesting to me was the idea of, well, how do older adults age in an urban area? Because immediately it struck me as a place where it could be easier to age, right? Having all of these resources in closer proximity, a wonderful way to support someone's quality of life. And one of the things that I did in the context of my work was I was volunteering with some older adults. And I was connected to an older woman who had Alzheimer's disease. And it was actually her daughter who introduced me to the concept of the NORC, the naturally occurring retirement community. She told me about Penn South, which is the community with which I now work. Cynthia introduced me to the program director at that time, and wonderful enough to allow me to actually become an intern. From that experience, I learned about this really amazing model. And honestly, it came from the community's concern about their older adults. Lots of people in their middle age moved in the 1960s, and they stayed. They stayed throughout the 60s, the 70s, and by the time the 80s came, they did a demographic assessment of the co-op. 70% of the population was now over the age of 60.
After graduating college and obtaining her master's degree, Anne worked with older people in many different capacities. Knowing that you had that trajectory, not only in your personal life, but that you worked with families at Caring Kind, you worked with caregivers, you've worn practically every hat conceivable to do the work that you're doing now. And so what I want you to tell me is, what does someone who heads a NORC do?
So the NORC model, I think, is a fantastic one because it really does count on an interdisciplinary team to provide support in key areas for older adults. The foundational support systems of a NORC include social work services, nursing or healthcare services, as well as what we sort of generally refer to as group services, but we're talking about group engagement, right? Opportunities for socialization, for ongoing learning, for example. And so I'm very lucky to be able to oversee a wonderful team. There's 10 professionals. We're working together to try to provide the support that anyone needs to meet their changing needs as they age in place at the NORC. And what that means is that we're open to providing support, assistance, engagement to anyone at Penn South over the age of 60. That's a long spectrum of aging because our folks begin at 60. We have 202-year-old clients right now. We're very mindful of that at looking at what the different generations are that are represented and what's going to be meaningful and appropriate and supportive to them.
Some of your residents could live for 40 years. Not always the case, but generally speaking, 60-year-olds are relatively young people, and there are people who have the good fortune of being 80 and 90 and not a care in the world. You mean they may have the general complaints of aging, but all in all, they are self-supporting individuals. How does a place like Penn South or any NORC try to meet the needs of their residents at different stages of their lives?
On the premise that we are there to help facilitate an existing community network, relationships that are already there, a community that is already strong and vibrant community. I mean, one of the main things that we just need to do is listen to the residents. What's of interest to them, and how can we build programming that engages those interests? At Penn South, because it's located in Chelsea, many are longtime lovers of theater and Broadway. We know that our folks love participating in things like drama class, improv. We had an amazing partnership with NYU Drama Therapy last year, where 17 of our members participated in a production of Fiddler on the Roof. What's wonderful is we're not just looking at providing programming, it's also about receiving. So one of the ways that we engage our younger members, which is just as important, is we give them opportunities to give to us. We have so many of our NORC members who work for us as program instructors. We have a member who is also a gardener. Even in an urban area, she has a beautiful, beautiful garden on her terrace. And so she runs one of our most popular classes, an indoor gardening class. And so a huge component of our program is volunteering. It's actually our members also volunteering to help others in whatever way is appropriate. It's a give and a take. I mean, I think that's the beauty of a true sort of community-based program.
I was smiling when you were talking about the younger members leading classes. For a lot of people, when they stop working, when they stop gaining an income, some people relish it, other people dread it because there's such a drastic change in your life. You go from being a very active person to being somebody that, if you're not careful, becomes too sedentary. And so giving the older residents who are on the younger side have almost a second or a third chapter in their life. They're still doing something that makes them feel alive and allows them to be a contributing member, not only to society, but to their more immediate community. Because you would want somebody to do that for you someday when you find yourself in that situation, not if, when. I really am heartened to hear that there are residents on the younger side and people also are contemporaries that understand the importance of supporting older residents. You have over 1,000 residents. There are 10 of you. That's a big disparity there. How many of those 1,000 residents in the NORC, what percentage are the ones that most heavily rely on you and your other 9 colleagues?
First of all, let me step back and give you a little bit more perspective on the demographics. Penn South is about 5,000 residents, and about 2,500 of them are older adults. We only touch about 1,000.
NORCs are voluntary, and people engage with them only if they want to and whenever they need it. Anne told me that a good number of the residents who are over the age of 60 are active, do so mainly to socialize, but the social work and medical component is of service to others.
Our social workers, we have 4, they are the ones who are providing the most intensive assistance to the clients with the greatest needs and who really require a level of care coordination that only our social workers can provide with the relatively small caseload to keep them in their home. So of our 4 social workers, they each have a caseload of about 40 clients. But you're talking about like about 100, 120 clients of that overall 1,000, maybe, a little bit over 10% who have really intensive needs. And so that's how we organize it, is we have that social work team that is dedicated to provide that intensive support to keep those clients in the community as long as possible. And of course, they can't do it alone. Like I said, most of those clients are either benefiting from the informal support of a family member or a friend, and some formal support of a home health aide, whether that's someone that they're paying for privately while they still have the resources, or potentially eventually someone that's paid for by Medicaid once a client reaches the point where they don't have resources to pay for the care that they need. And then our nurses, again, are working both with the social workers to support those clients with, higher, more intense needs as it relates to, medical management and healthcare management.
During your tenure, how many older people have left the NORC setting because they couldn't stay there anymore?
It's a relatively low percentage. I'd have to go back and do the numbers, but I want to say no more than 1 or 2%. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen. There are situations where individuals' needs, particularly in situations where someone has dementia, they become too challenging to manage in the home. Or I would say that in some situations, family members decide that it's time to move the individual to somewhere closer to them. And some of the cases where we're seeing people have to be transitioned to nursing homes, it's because where you could get the 24-hour care that you needed through the Medicaid system, you can't get that care anymore, as you know, without a real significant fight.
You have to fight. You have to fight for those hours. Listen, personally, and I'll say it, I'm not a big fan of nursing homes. I'm not going to say that all of them are bad. I think that they deal with a lot of constraints and challenges. I think the nursing home model should change, but I would like to see what would happen if more people were allowed to age in place with 24-hour care, because it is cheaper. It is.
I have to say that sadly, we're still seeing the managed long-term care companies trying to push people off of home care services. And that, again, is another amazing piece to the NORC model, is because, as you know, you usually can't fight the managed long-term care company without an advocate, and without an advocate who knows how to put up that fight. And so our social work team works in conjunction with elder law attorneys, wonderful groups like the New York Legal Assistance Group, to prepare and to represent people in their fair hearings, for example. One of the best ways to support people to age with dignity, as you said, is to allow them to age in the home. Again, some people benefit from facilities. I agree with you. Nursing homes aren't my number one choice, but some people do better in them because they need the socialization. But again, in a NORC where we're trying to provide that socialization in other ways and keep the person in their own space, in the place where they're most comfortable, I think that's the ideal. That's really the best of both worlds. But it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to do it because the systems aren't set up to allow you to do it very well.
No. How many NORCs are there in New York City alone?
I believe we're up to 34.
Anne explained that some NORCs receive funding from the city and state government, while others only receive funding from one stream. Penn South receives it from both. There's a reapplication at the state level every year. She also told me that her NORC was in the process of reapplying for their funding through the city. This happens every 6 years. Knowing city budgets like she does, she was doubtful they could expand the current number of NORCs.
We have 3 million older people over the age of 60 in New York City alone. And Los Angeles has probably around 1 million. And Los Angeles geographically looks very different than New York City. It has sprawl. Places like Houston and Dallas have 100,000, 200,000 older people. What do you think it is that keeps older people in the city and not moving to a place like Florida or to North Carolina, Texas? Like, those are all the popular places that I hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a couple of reasons. I mean, overall, older adults are often, as you know, individuals that don't have a lot of financial means. They are transitioning into retirement and into living on a fixed income. And so I think moving to begin with is often not an option for a lot of people unless they have additional resources. I also do think home is about so much more than a place. It's tied in with who you are, what makes you feel like you belong, and what gives your life meaning. And so I don't think people want to leave a place that they know makes them feel good or makes them feel part of something bigger. And in certain situations, proximity, for example, Eastern Queens looks very different than Penn South, of course. We're still a tight city.
If you were talking to somebody who was living, let's not say they're not in New York City, but they're living in an area that has a lot of older people and they wanted to create a NORC, what do you think are the best elements of a NORC?
The fact that this model is rooted in community. It's the fact that this model is about neighbors taking care of neighbors. Again, even though it doesn't always, it plays out in different ways in different communities. And I certainly, I can only speak from the Penn South perspective. But again, you talk about creating a NORC program that particularly in New York City and New York State, if you're going to apply for city or state funding, there's certain criteria you have to meet. And one of those major criteria is that there does have to be an agreement, a partnership between the housing partner, in Penn South's case, the management company and the board of directors, as well as a social service partner, which is JASA for Penn South, and a healthcare partner as well. So it's idea that you're taking all of these different strengths that exist in a community and you're bringing them together to support that community. The best thing about it is you as a community are recognizing the communal responsibility to take care of those older adults.
On the flip side, what's the challenge? The challenges.
I mean, I'll be honest and say the challenge is funding, most significantly. Penn South is very lucky because, again, the reason that its NORC program was created was because everyone in the community was bought into this idea that we are going to take care of our older adults. It's not the same everywhere. One of the best examples I can give you is the New York City Housing Authority has many complexes that qualify as NORCs because over 50% of the populations are older adults. But NYCHA as a government entity says, well, we can't contribute to these services. And that is actually one of the requirements to get funding from the city or state is that your housing organization contributes something to the budget. NYCHA gets to be exempt from that. As a result, those communities don't necessarily have budgets as large as NORC programs like ours that are in a co-op model. So they're already dealing with fewer resources. And I think that when there isn't money in the game, and if there isn't skin in the game, then there isn't always the same level of cooperation.
Your NORC is in Chelsea. As long as I've been alive, that's always been a good neighborhood. And it's surrounded by other good neighborhoods. They're co-ops, which means that these individuals own where they live, you're paying your maintenance, you're in a good neighborhood, and you have connections, you're going to fare better than somebody who has a lower socioeconomic status, does not own where they live. Quite the opposite. They live in subsidized housing. They don't have the same amount of income and resources. Their aging experience will be very different. And they most likely don't even have the same support networks, formal or informal, that people at other NORCs have. So even if you are a NORC, but you happen to be a NORC in an economically depressed neighborhood or in an area that has a high concentration of public housing, you're working at a disadvantage.
Absolutely, because of the socioeconomic disparities. And I think that has to be recognized, again, as a way, if we're going to fight for, racial equality, income equality, this is something that has to be recognized, as we know, throughout the entire system. And that includes the systems that support our older adults.
What is the racial and ethnic makeup of the residents of Penn South? Because I never asked you that question.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's overwhelmingly white. Penn South actually doesn't keep racial and ethnic statistics, which is interesting. But based on our programmatic participation, where we do keep those statistics, it is overwhelmingly white. We are talking about 88 to 90%, with a growing Latinx and a growing Asian community as well. Now, what's very interesting is you contrast Penn South with the Elliott Chelsea houses, which are right across the avenue, which is a predominantly people of color, Black and Latino older adult. You can't absolutely deny that, there are these racial and economic disparities, and it does impact how people are going to age.
Based on your experience, not only at Penn South, but throughout your career, what do you think cities can do to allow their older residents to age in place?
This goes beyond cities. I do think it is crucial that there needs to be long-term care insurance in a broader way than what we have at this moment, which is, as you know, Medicaid is the only form of public health insurance that covers long-term care, and it doesn't cover long-term care for everyone. Obviously, someone has to be impoverished. And on the state level, states get to decide what that long-term care looks like. They are only mandated, of course, to provide Medicaid to cover care in nursing homes and long-term care facilities, but then states have the choice to provide in-home services. New York is thankfully one of the few states that actually allocates Medicaid dollars to that purpose.
Looking back to the Anne Foerg that interned at Penn South when she was in college, to the Anne Foerg of now, what have you learned about the population that you have dedicated your career to?
I think the thing that I've learned more than anything else is that we all are guilty at some point in our lives of stereotyping individuals. And I think I had some preconceived notions about older adults myself, even getting into this. They would certainly fall on the positive end of the spectrum in terms of the stereotypes, because again, I was drawn to working with this population, but just because a stereotype is positive doesn't make it right, of course, either. And I would just say that I think more than anything else, I've recognized that the beauty in aging is its diversity. Aging population is a microcosm of our entire population, that the aging population is not this monolithic group, that it represents a spectacular diversity of experience and just a contribution to the world in which we live.
What have they taught you?
I definitely have learned that there is beauty and dignity in the pain. The situations that I have, of course, worked most intensively with in my life happen to be ones that are usually very difficult and challenging because of medical conditions and cognitive impairment, family difficulty, financial difficulty. The most wonderful lessons I've seen is where folks that I've worked with have embraced those difficult experiences, accepted them as part of the joy of living.
Is there a client that comes to mind? Is there that one client that you've just never forgotten about, or that one experience?
Anne begins to tell me the story of a client she met while she worked at Hartley House, which is a settlement house in New York. This client was the, quote, black sheep of her family, who had run off to the big city to become a lounge singer. She became involved with a man and for many years suffered domestic violence at his hands. This further separated her from her family. The abusive partner eventually died. When Anne met her, this client was living in a studio apartment with very little income. She was pretty embittered by her life experiences. One of the bright spots in her life was the baby grand piano she refused to part with. She had no one, and unfortunately was diagnosed with lung cancer. She entered a nursing home and hospice. And here's where the story takes a happy turn.
But one thing she did finally allow me to do is she agreed that I could try to search for her family. Through the power of the internet, I was able to find a niece of hers. They were able to be reconnected. My client's sister had previously passed away, so they didn't get to reconnect. And she was able to make the promise to her aunt that she would make sure that that baby grand was given a new home and it was going to be given to a family member. And my client was so happy at the end of her life when she finally died, that despite this very tough life, that she was so thrilled to know that she hadn't been forgotten by her family. They had never stopped loving her, and that they cared enough about her to make this final wish happen.
In what way, if any, did meeting this woman affect how you approach other people, other older people? What did she teach you?
It's the idea that everyone has a reason for why they are acting the way they are, why they're engaging in the world the way they are. That was the biggest lesson, because this would be someone who would be seen as the, quote unquote, difficult client. She taught me, as every single client does, compassion, empathy. We've got to try to connect with other people's stories and put ourselves in other people's shoes.
You work in a NORC, and you alluded to the very real fact that people are getting older and that the population is increasingly older and our world is changing. What do you see in the future of NORCs? How do you see them evolving?
I think one of the things that we're going to have to do as a model is contend with the new ways in which healthcare is being provided. As a NORC program, you're required to have a healthcare partner, usually someone who is able to provide you with nursing services. Yet, interestingly enough, the nursing service requirement has always been an unfunded mandate. So recently, year to year, most NORCs in the city have had to go to their city council person and request a discretionary allocation, because every city council person has a certain amount of discretionary dollars that they're able to award programs in their district. And we've had to avail of ourselves of those discretionary dollars to cover our nursing costs, because the organizations that used to provide nursing services as an in-kind donation are unable to do so anymore because they're not making the same money anymore. So I do think that there is going to have to be a re-envisioning or rethinking of how do we partner with our healthcare organizations to make sure we're bringing the healthcare component into the community, because I do think that that's crucial to the NORC model, and this interdisciplinary model on which we operate, where we have the social workers, we have the healthcare providers, is crucial to keeping people in their homes. We want to keep them out of the hospital anyway. It goes back to that home care issue of why aren't people putting more focus on giving care in the community so we can prevent the institutionalizations, whether that be hospitalizations for an acute condition or, again, an institutionalization for a long-term care situation.
And I absolutely agree with you that healthcare, I think, for me, is the linchpin in any sort of aging in place or aging populations in general. If you want an older person to age in place, you have to be able to provide medical care that will allow them to remain in their homes. What do older people that live in the city who don't live in a NORC do?
Really depends on the neighborhood. I would say that in theory, the cities case management system. They sort of set themselves up as this is an entree into kind of all of the resources an older adult might want. It's kind of a single point of entry. You get hooked up with the case management program, you get a case manager, you get an assessment that you can get linked up to all of the services that you need. In practice, its case management program in New York City, the New York City funded one, is more of a gatekeeper for these concrete services. They're not all encompassing. So honestly, it really depends on the neighborhood and if there are other sort of additional supports in the neighborhood that is well versed at what's available for older adults. The other resource, churches, synagogues, mosques, it's the religious connection. People go to their community of faith and that's where they start in terms of what can I do to sort of stay here. But it's inconsistent across the city. NORCs are the situation where I think we do it best in terms of being that one-stop shop for kind of all of the information and the support and the resources that you would need. We exist to be able to help people navigate this entire system, no matter what point they're sort of entering. And that just isn't consistent across the city at all.
As always, I want to thank my guest, Anne Foerg, for her time, expertise, and the value of her experiences. There are quite a few takeaways from this episode, mainly the value in older people and their desire to remain not only aging in place in their homes, but also in the communities that they help to build and that they've contributed to. Old people and their happiness is a worthwhile investment, no matter where you live. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Aging Wisely, the podcast. As always, I would like to acknowledge Adam Galchis and his family band, The Waffles, for my theme music. If you like my podcast, please subscribe or follow. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, Pandora, SoundCloud, or if you spend time on YouTube, the podcast has a channel by the same name where you can find the episodes. If you'd like to learn more about the podcast, you can go to agingwiselypodcast.com and look around. Listen to this and prior episodes, and even better, subscribe to my newsletter. Every 2 weeks, the most recent episodes and the transcript to the current episode straight into your inbox. And if you liked this episode, I would love a review on your favorite platform. Believe it or not, reviews help to spread a podcast's message. And if you enjoy the podcast or have benefited from it in any way, please let others know about it. I would appreciate it. Join me for another episode in 2 weeks. Bye.